We're going to be talking tonight about one of the biggest fears that everyone has in here, and that is in-laws. Some of you laughed, so that's good. All right, Exodus chapter 18. So, as far as the context goes, the title here is When Listening Pays Off, and it is going to be in relationship to in-laws. How many of you listen to your in-laws? A few of you, okay. How many of you love listening to your in-laws? A little bit less, okay. All right. We're just going to go with the title here, When Listening Pays Off. And listening, and that whole entire idea goes farther than just dealing with in-laws. Many times we have to sit and listen, whether it's tonight when you're sitting in the pews listening to a message, or when my spouse decides to have a conversation with me. I am often reminded that I need to listen, or just about any time that we have in conversation, there is some moment of listening. But you know, when it comes in relationship with God, we also need to listen to Him as well. And how do you do that? Well, there's the teaching of God's Word. We need to read that. We need to listen to it. But when is listening actually listening? It's when we take it in the ears and we process it and we act upon it. Because sometimes we listen and there is no action. You know what I'm saying? A lot of times we hear the word of God, but we don't obey it. Sometimes we take an instruction and it goes in one ear and out the other. Have you ever heard that one before? Have you ever stated that one before? And so this is when listening is going to pay off tonight. We're going to be talking about that. But in context, we have just jumped off of a major victory. Do you remember what happened last week when I had Jack come up here and he had to hold that bat over his head for so long? And he did a really good job with that. But I imagine how well he would have done that, holding it up for as long as that battle took. Out in the sun. It's one thing to be in the air conditioning and holding up the bat, but then when you're sweating like crazy out in the sun, that might be a totally different story. And so we come back from that victory, not because of the power of the people, but because of the power of God that was on display. And we saw the symbol of the staff that he held up into the air. That was the symbol of the power of God on display. When that was up, there was victory. When that was down, they were starting to become defeated. And so they actually were able to conquer the Amalekites, and now they have come to the Mount of God, exactly the place where God promised that they would come to and where they would serve. Now, like I said, what is next? It's not another army. It's not no food. It's not no water. It is Moses' father-in-law coming to visit. But it's not just his father-in-law, it's also his family. All of a sudden, we've come to a place in time where Moses' two worlds have collided. As you look back to the beginning of Exodus, we had realized that at that point, there was, could we say, a debate amongst Moses and his wife that got a little heated. Can we say, use that as the nice term there? And we understood at that point that Moses had actually split from his wife and his children. They went back to Jethro, the father-in-law, while he went off to go and lead God's people out of Egypt. Now, all of a sudden, they've come to a point where they're coming together. All of a sudden, Moses is going to have to balance leading his family and leading these people through the wilderness. How's he going to deal with that? How's he going to respond as Jethro moves in to have some conversations with him? So let's go ahead and jump into that first point, listening to Moses about God. And the implication there is that Jethro was actually listening to Moses about God. So in verse number 1, it says there in Exodus chapter 18, it says, when Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, and that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. All of a sudden, we find that Jethro has heard of what God has done, how that Israel is out of Egypt. He knows that Moses was going to try to go and do that, but he hears there's actually success. Now, I come to this question in my mind: how did Jethro find out about Moses getting out of Egypt? Because it's not like he just did a little Marco Polo. Hey, Jethro. Hey, father-in-law. Hey, I'm on my way out to your direction. We'll be there in a few months and meet you there. He didn't call him up. He didn't send smoke signals. How did Jethro know? Well, he could have had a messenger sent out to Jethro to let them know that they were going to be there. But I also think that they could have had news from trade with other peoples that were coming through, even Egyptians. And you say, well, wait a minute, the Egyptians would have had interactions with the Midianites? And I would say yes, because if you go back all the way to Exodus chapter 2 and verse 19, in response to Moses showing up, and in that situation where Jethro's daughters were having some issues with some other shepherds that were in the area, and Moses shows up and he helps out. When the daughters came back to Jethro, they're letting him know what's going on. And they said, an Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. So they knew who the Egyptians were. They knew what they looked like. Even though Moses wasn't naturally an Egyptian, he would have looked like an Egyptian. He would have dressed like an Egyptian. They would have had that connection. They would have had that understanding of Egypt. And so I think that there could have been some interaction to where they would have known that, hey, Israel made it out. And that would have been big news. For an empire to lose an entire people group of slaves. But not only that, but also the Egyptian army drowning in the midst of the Red Sea. That would have been big news. That would have spread around. And so I think at that point that there would have been an understanding through trade routes, or at least a messenger to let him know what was going on. So in Exodus chapter 18 and verse 2, we'll move on. It says, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. So Moses had sent her back to Jethro. Jethro was taking Zipporah, his wife, and her two sons, of which the name of the one was Gershom, for he said, I have been an alien in a strange land. And the name of the other was Eleazar, for the God of my father said he was mine help and delivered me from the sword of Pharaoh. So these two boys, which were named in relation to the struggles that Moses was facing, but also in the victory that was there, Moses' boys and Zipporah have come back with Jethro to Moses. It says in verse 5, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife unto Moses into the wilderness, where he encamped at the Mount of God. And again, how would he know that they were going to be at the Mount of God? Well, again, it could have been messengers. It could have been trade with Egyptians, or trade with other people that would have said, hey, there's a big old massive people group that is coming along this route to the mount here. And so there could have been an expectation, but I also believe that when Moses went to Jethro, when God commissioned him, called him out of Midian, away from from Jethro and his job there, when Moses was called, he actually goes back and he talks to Jethro about the commissioning that God gave. So in Exodus 3:12, it says, and he said, certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be a token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. When Moses was talking to Jethro, as you see, here's another verse here. I'll just relate this. Exodus 4:18. And Moses went and returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said unto him, Let me go, I pray thee, and return unto my brethren which are in Egypt, and see whether they be yet alive. And Jethro said to Moses, Go in peace. Go in peace. So what God had promised back in Exodus chapter 3 of you will come back to this mountain to serve me on this mountain. That's how you know everything is good and my promises are good. You're going to come back to this very mountain. This is my plan. I am imagining that he goes back to Jethro and relays this information so Jethro knows where Moses is coming back to. So those were the questions that were coming up right in the beginning. How does Jethro know when there's really no communication? Well, I believe that there is, in the past, that there would have been that communication given, that truth given, so they would have known where they could have met, where they could meet up in case this could happen as far as Jethro bringing his family back to him. So let's jump into Exodus chapter 18, verse 6, and continue along. And he said unto Moses, I, thy father-in-law, Jethro, and come unto thee, and thy wife and her 2 sons with her. And Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, and did obeisance, and kissed him. And they asked each other of their welfare, and they came into the tent. And what happened in the tent? Now, where would your mind go? How many are father-in-laws in here? Have a daughter, obviously married off, okay? So what happens? What's your thought process when if all of a sudden, let's say Style comes up to Dan and says, Hey, Dan, you got to take Whitney and the kids. I'm going on a mission. I'm going over to Pana, and I'm changing everything over at the school district over there, and it's too big of a job. I'm going to hand off my family to you. You take care of them. Are you okay with that? It's like, I finally had freedom. Now, if they come over for like a few hours, that's okay. Maybe stay over the night, that's okay. I'll just pump them full of candy and take them back. You know, that's good. You're fine. Style. She's your job, right? Okay? Is that your thought that's going through your head? At least that's some of the thoughts that might be going through some of your heads right now. But you know what? When Jethro goes back to meet up with his son-in-law, who sent Zipporah and his sons back to Jethro to be taken care of by Jethro, he never chews them out. He never gets mad. He never calls them a failure. He never cuts them down. I've thought of that. If Jethro in this moment would have called him out for sending his family back right in front of all this people, what do you think that the people would start thinking? Man, he couldn't handle his family, and he's trying to take us across the desert? Whoa. Do you know what happens here? I love the conversation that comes up in Exodus chapter 18 and starting in verse 8. And Moses told his father-in-law all that the Lord had done unto Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the travail that had come upon them by the way, and how the Lord delivered them. When we get into a story, a lot of times we like to focus, if we're in a complaining mood, we focus on all our complaints, don't we? How everything's bad, how everything's ugly, how everything's rough. I can't get through life. Here's all my problems. But when we want to show off and show off our pride, what do? Well, I did this. I did that. I loved what I did here. Here, check out this. Let me show you how I did this. But when I read through what Moses is describing here, he says, Listen, this is what God did to the Egyptians. And yeah, there was a ton of issues, toils, complaints. The people were complaining here. They had no water here. They had no food here. Amalek came against us. All these things. And yet, God delivered us. God delivered us. How do we testify about our lives? Anybody have a trial this past week? Okay, a few. A few of you want to raise your hands, all right? We have our trials. They're there. If you walk around and you say, I have never had any problems in my entire life, my marriage is great, and no problems whatsoever, we always agree, we always smile at each other, there's all these, just everything's just a bed of roses, I just love life. How would you respond to that? Well, that person's nose just grew a little bit. They need a reality check. Because we know what is reality. There are problems, there are toils, there are pains that we walk through when you're reminded every morning when you're trying to roll out of bed and things are creaking and it doesn't want you to get out of bed, right? Your body just wants to stay there. And then you go to, since we're out of school, you go to school, just remind you of school, right? You go to school and you deal with these people, and you know what? The kids didn't do their homework, and I go to work, and I've got all these coworkers that aren't doing their job, and I have to do all their work for them, and all these things that we talk about that happens in our lives, and we understand that they're there. Man, I really fell short in my relationship. Man, I just didn't speak right here. I didn't speak right here. I got angry here, quick to anger. I was fast to wrath. I provoked my children to wrath in this situation. And yes, there's a lot of issues, but you know the difference between one who follows after God and one who doesn't is the fact that that person is going to come back to, you know what? God either has delivered or he's going to deliver. I have hope. That's when we come back and we start talking about amazing grace. We start talking about our God is an awesome God. We get to praise, we get to testify. And what happens when Jethro has an ear to be able to listen? What does he do? Because remember, in the very first verse, how did it describe Jethro? It said that he was the priest of Midian. Anybody catch that? Do you think he was full of religion? Was he full of God? Full of religion? Do you think he thought maybe he had a greater understanding of what religion is and the gods that are out there, right? Because there was a lot of civilizations out there that were very much polytheistic. They had a ton of gods that they believed in. Did he actually believe in God himself? Well, as we move through here, we see here in verse number 9, and Jethro rejoiced for all the goodness which the Lord had done to Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of Egyptians. And Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord, who hath delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, who hath delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods. Whoa. Hold on for a second. You were the priest of Midian, and now you're just coming to the conclusion that God is greater than all the gods? So there's multiple gods that he was thinking of that could have been in power beforehand. What if he would have stepped in here and said, listen, Egypt's gods are the true gods. You shouldn't have battled it out with them. You should have let them do what they needed to do. You shouldn't have fought them. You should have just been subservient to them. Well, what about all these other gods that you're not paying attention to? You say there's one God, and yet there's all these others that we pay attention to, and yet he never goes that route. He understands at this point, now I know that the Lord is greater than all gods. For in the thing wherein they dealt proudly, he was above them. They came in with their arrogance. They thought that they can control the situation. They thought that they had their cool magic tricks. They thought that they had the power. They thought that they had those cool snakes that would come in and try to show up Aaron and Moses with their snake. And yet God was above them all. That's what he rejoiced in. That's what he listened to. That's where he connected the dots. That our God is the most awesome God there ever was, or is, or will be. Because, folks, he is the only God. He's the only one. But the problem that we face is we often create our own little gods, don't we? Do you remember your moment when you came to Jesus? When God saved you? Do you remember that? When you came to the conclusion that God is greater than any other gods that are out there, now I know. Now I know that he's bigger and he's better than anything that I could create in my imagination. Now I know that God is bigger and greater and created a plan for me, a redemptive plan by sending Jesus. And now I know, and now I'm going to act upon this knowing by putting my faith in God. See, he needed to listen. He could have came in and said, listen, I know everything about religion. You have nothing to tell me. I mean, it's just cool, it's great. There's a little bit of power, but listen, all these other, no, he stopped, he listened. He listened to what Moses had to testify of the works of God. I've mentioned this before. We're at college. We had a certain day that we would spend the chapel just testifying of the works of God. And the qualification behind your testimony meant that you had to talk about what God did. Not about what you did, but what about God did. And I loved hearing how God showed up. And the only thing that you could come to the conclusion of was this is a God thing. He just showed up in that person's life, and that person's life, and that person's life. How glorious our God is. Now, what about when we testify? See, we can either testify of our complaints and stop there, or we can say, yeah, I got a flat tire this week, but man, God showed up. How did he show up? Well, that's for you to figure out. See what God is doing in your life. Man, I lost control this week. I lost control. Nobody else made me lose control. I lost control. But you know what? Our God is a good God. And he gave me mercy. He gave me grace. Do we end our stories with how good God is? Or do we just end it with our problems? Everybody knows we have problems. Everybody's got problems. But the difference between a follower of God and one who doesn't follow after God is the fact that we can come back to God and see how God is working in our lives because he works all things together for good. Do not love God according to his purpose for those that are called? According to his purpose, this is his plan. This is what we are trusting in. And so Jethro had his moment to listen to the good, the bad, and the ugly, and came back to see how God delivered and responded, and could respond in rejoicing. You see there, verse 12, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God. And Aaron came and all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. This is his response. Man, wouldn't it be cool if when we testified through our trials of God's goodness, that other people who were testifying to would turn around and worship God? Wouldn't that change your day? Wouldn't that help you push forward? Take another step? If we concluded with rejoicing and worship. So it doesn't stop there. It goes on. Listening to Jethro about leadership, all of a sudden, something changes. It says there in verse 13, and it came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood by Moses from the morning unto the evening. Jethro shows up with Moses' family. He brings them to him. Hey, this is your family. Brought them to you. Now all of a sudden Moses has regained this responsibility of his family, but the next day he wakes up and he goes back his normal business. He goes back into dealing with all the people and going and hearing them all the way from morning all the way till night. Do you notice that there's any problems there? He just continued on in his lifestyle. And when we think about a leader, we think about, I was directly drawn to a passage in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 4. It says, one that ruleth well his own house, this is a qualification of a pastor, is one that ruleth well his own house, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? And so all of a sudden, Moses went to work. He kept with his routine. But Jethro, he sees that there is an issue here. It says in verse 14 of Exodus 18, and when Moses' father-in-law saw that he did to the people, he said, what is this thing that thou doest to the people? Why sittest thou thyself alone, and all the people stand by thee from morning until evening? See, he didn't know everything that happened. He's only been there for a day. He could only grasp this perspective for one day and see what happens, what Moses does as his job, as being a leader. And he says, what are you doing? And Moses said unto his father-in-law, because the people come unto me to inquire of God. They want to know about God. From morning to evening, they want to know. Verse 16, but when they have a matter, they come unto me, and I judge between one and another, and I do make them know the statuses of God and his laws. They come to me for matters. I bring God's law in. I talk to them about what God wants. I bring God to their attention. Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Bringing God to people's attention. This is a good thing. This is what we should be doing. But Moses' father-in-law said unto him, the thing that thou doest is not good. Why? What's the problem? Where is it falling short? Verse 18, thou wilt surely wear away both thou and this people that is with thee. For this thing is too heavy for thee. Thou art not able to perform it thyself alone. Moses, you can't keep doing this. You're going to wear away. Your people are going to wear away. You can't be everything for everyone in this entire people group. So what do you need to do? Hearken now unto my voice. I will give thee counsel, and God shall be with thee. Be thou for the people to Godward, that thou mayest bring the causes unto God. So it says, I want you to listen to me, heed my counsel. God is with you. And you're still going to bring these causes to God in these situations. It says in verse 20, and thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk and the work that they must do. Moreover, thou shalt provide out of all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands and rulers of hundreds and rulers of fifties and rulers of tens. So he says, you're going to be doing all of these same good things. You're going to still teach them about God. You're still going to judge the issues that come up. You're going to bring them back to God's law. You're going to do all the same things, coming back to God. But you need to find people who are going to help you. And not just breathing bodies. But he says you need to find able men, ones that fear God. They love truth, and they hate covetousness. If they're not after greed, then they're going to not go to the whim of the richest person or the one who has the most sway or the most politics that goes on here. He says, listen, you need to go and grasp onto those who are going to hold on to the truth, do what needs to be done. And you know, Moses could have stepped back and he could have said, no. I have been doing this since we got out of Egypt. Who are you to come in and step into my way and tell me what to do? And yet in that moment, he listened. He listened. Jethro goes on and says, and they let them judge the people at all seasons, and it shall be that every great matter they shall bring unto thee, but every small matter they shall judge. So it shall be easier for thyself, and they shall bear the burden with thee. This is not your burden to be able to bear all alone. These people are going to help you. It says in verse 23, if thou shalt do this thing, and God command thee so, then thou shalt be able to endure, and all this people shall also go to their place in peace. See, he keeps bringing it back to God. If God commands thee, hey, I'm letting out this counsel, but if God is the one that's about this, then God's going to bless you and making this happen and bearing this burden. He says in verse 24, so Moses hearkened to the voice of his father-in-law and did all that he had said. He didn't speak up and say, how dare you come into my place and talk to me about this when I'm trying to lead these people. He just stepped back in humility. He listened and he applied. And verse 25, and Moses chose able men out of the Israel and made them heads over the people, rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of fifties, and rulers of tens. And they judged the people at all seasons. The hard causes they brought unto Moses, but every small matter they judged themselves. And Moses let his father-in-law depart, and he went his way into his own land. Burden shared. I love these two stories brought together in the fact when two guys who could have had it out for each other come together, respect one another, love and care for one another, and bring it back to God in dealing with their responsibilities. Here, let me tell you, here's the problems, but here's how God delivered. Jethro listened, turning to faith. Next, you go in, hey, Moses, I'm seeing an issue here. This is too much. You're going to wear out. You're not enough for this. You are inadequate. You need to be able to spread the load to be able to take care of this people. You are not enough. And you know what? If God is behind this, he's going to bless you. Keep bringing it back to God. You're going to keep teaching them the word. I'm not taking away from that. I'm just trying to help you out. And Moses listened and is able to spread burden. So it comes back. Listening really does pay off. Why is it so hard for us to listen, though? I mean, if we were all to confess and say, have you ever struggled with listening to people who God has brought into your life to help you through a situation? Have you ever struggled listening to God himself? What happens in those scenarios? We often get caught up in ourselves. We struggle through it. We get mad. We get bitter. And really not much of God comes out in those experiences. Here's our reminder from two different experiences tonight with Moses and Jethro of how they turned away from what could have been to a point where they came in and they listened, and there was profit to both and a God-honoring way.